Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Here to discuss his speech, which is coming up probably in the next 5 or 10 minutes, although you know how these things go, the New Statesman Helen Lewis and Faisal Shaheen, prospective parliamentary candidate for Chingford. Welcome to both of you. First of all, Helen, what we already know about some of the announcements that John McDonnell's made, what do you make of it?
Well, he's thrown out some red meat. So this idea about increasing employee ownership, you can sell it two ways. You can either say it's just an extreme version of what John Lewis is doing with its employee partnership model, or a Silicon Valley startup. Or you can take it the way that the CBI have said it, where they've kind of had a massive conniption and said this is a diktat, sort of semi-Marxist diktat. And I think what's important is it is equally readable in both of those ways, because the kind of story of John McDonnell and his time as Shadow Chancellor is about mediating his radicalism that people have known about for a long time and kind of trying to put himself across as a kind of bank manager, right?
Yes, but is he softening his tone? Isn't that the point? As he thinks power is getting closer, he isn't talking about the overthrow of capitalism anymore. He is talking about stakeholders and shareholders. Does that worry you?
No, not at all. I mean, what I see actually is an attempt to do something at the root of why we have inequalities in this country, doing something about workers' pay and their power in the workplace over the longer term. So I think this is really about spreading wealth in the real sense. This is really about, alongside other measures as well, so we heard about workers on boards again yesterday, this is about a new program by which you do the democratization of the economy as well as more broadly.
Well, you're talking about inequality and dealing with it. We will have fact-check Joel looking over all the statistics and facts that will no doubt come up in John McDonnell's speech or in our discussion here. There he is, working away in the newsroom, just to remind people, on inequality. The Institute of Fiscal Studies, in their latest annual report, Faisal said, since the late 2000s, the incomes of low-income households in London have risen by more than 10%, while the incomes of high-income households, the 90th percentile at the top, have fallen by more than 10%. In the UK as a whole, income inequality was still lower in 2015-16 than prior to the recession. Do you accept that?
So one of the things, and if you ask IFS researchers themselves, and I've done this, is that they don't capture the extremes in that data. So what we know of is that at the very bottom...
Well, they're talking about the lowest 10th percentile
so
and the top
1% and the bottom 1%, say. So we know, and they'll say this, they just don't capture that in their data. So we know that there's far more usage of food banks, that there's homelessness has tripled. We see that, there's no lies about that, right? And we know also that the rich list every year is increasing and increasing. They've seen a doubling in wealth for 10 years. So I think
But
yes.
You say that inequality has got worse, and the statistics from the IFS, I take your point maybe at the extremes, just don't actually substantiate that.
I mean, there's two things to say about that. So absolutely, in the traditional way in which they're measuring it, the top 10%, bottom 10%, it does look that way, but visibly for people, it's quite obvious that's not the case. And secondly, wealth inequality in this country is far bigger than income inequality. Income inequality doesn't capture everything. I think a lot of people will not recognise a country, if you start saying that inequality's gone down, that's just not what we're seeing.
What about businesses? You mentioned the CBI. Yes, they've reacted badly to some of the proposals that John McDonnell has set out. Does Labour need business to be on board?
I think it does, and it's really interesting. This year, and as last year, I'm doing an event with John McDonnell and the Federation of Small Businesses, who have always been quite friendly to him. And the CBI traditionally is seen as much more right-wing, as you put it, in terms of their ideas. But the thing that's fascinating is the Tories have thrown away their automatic business credibility card right through Brexit. Because you're in a stage now where heads of big companies are saying, we don't know what we're going to do after next April. So that kind of automatic, well, the Tories are the party of business, is gone. So that, I think, has meant Labour feel that they do have this kind of time to be more radical, because there's no kind of safe alternative. It's not kind of chaos with Ed Miliband or stability with me, as David Cameron famously said. There's quite a lot of chaos whatever way you look in the outlook.
I wouldn't agree with that. One thing I would say is that the dialogue between John McDonnell's team and John McDonnell and the business community is huge. They put a lot of time into having that conversation.
Who are they talking to, Faisal?
So they're talking to the CBI, they're talking to the BC.
But the CBI has to some extent rubbished what he's proposing.
I mean, the point is that dialogue is there, and actually when you speak to people, I was speaking to someone very senior in the City of London, and they just said it's actually easier for us to get in touch with John McDonnell's team than it is with Theresa May's team. And that's what's happening. There's a difference in the way in which business are being treated by the Tories, like you say, because of Brexit, because of Boris saying things like business can, I can't say the word on telly.
Well, I mean, that's exactly the point, is that John McDonnell wants it, right? John McDonnell wants to be Chancellor. And actually, sometimes you see Jeremy Corbyn wandering around and you think, I think he'd be happy just waving at people forever. But John McDonnell has got a programme, an economic programme that he wants to put through. And as Pfizer says, that means he's going to go out and make his case to business. They're not always going to like it, but he does have an idea that he wants to try and win over as many people as possible.
Are they rewriting that manifesto? I mean, there has been talk from the Shadow Chancellor that it will be, of course, tweaked. He's joked about a second term and what he might do in a third term. Is it being beefed up from the figures that we saw last year?
I'm not sure where it will go in terms of the headline economic picture, but it was a very hastily put together manifesto,
sure,
right?
There wasn't much
Angela
time.
Rayner, for example, was, disgruntled about the fact there was money for tuition fees, but not for the under five. So some of that stuff will be remade. We've already heard about the idea of a year-long review of universal credit, which is something that's caused a lot of unhappiness. There wasn't a tighter policy on that last time around. And that snap election did lead to a snap manifesto, as it turned out, quite a popular manifesto, but not one that I think anyone would have agreed was the absolute finished Corbyn project manifesto.
But what about modelling on businesses and how they behave? On increasing corporation tax to 26%. Labour says it will raise something like 19 or 20 billion pounds, maybe in the first year. What happens after that?
Well, I think the point is that what Labour are trying to do with business is to create a new relationship. So 10 years ago, the banks got sold out, the banks got bailed out, we got sold out, and what's happened after there is that it feels as if business has been able to continue to do what they want to do. And this is about rewriting that relationship. This is about saying, well, look, we want a much fairer and more equal distribution.
And if those businesses move abroad, if they decide that actually it's not going to be conducive to them doing business here?
There's a lot of fearmongering. I mean, we've got to have more faith in this country that it's not just about taxes, why businesses are here. And they're not saying they're going to raise taxes a lot higher than other countries. They're just saying we're going to go back to what we had. I mean, we've had such a massive reduction in corporate taxes in this country. It's lower than the rest of the EU in terms of an average. So, I mean, it's not that radical, actually.
Right, the hall is filling up. In fact, it looks as if it is almost full, so we'll be expecting the Shadow Chancellor to stand up in the next few minutes, but we'll continue talking here just outside the conference hall. On that basis, though, about business behaviour, they, of course, are relied upon to invest in businesses, to provide jobs. Will that be under threat with things like increasing corporation tax?
I think the really fascinating thing about the last, I've been a political journalist now for 8 years, and we always took it for granted. The Tories would always say Labour will put up taxes on the highest earners and they'll move abroad. They'll put up tax on business and businesses will move abroad. Well, they can't do that anymore. Businesses are already moving abroad. People are moving their headquarters abroad. This is the kind of fascinating thing. What actually was the big lesson of the last couple of years of British politics is that, oh, there he goes.
We're going to have to stop you there. Here is John McDonnell, clapping himself just before he starts. The Shadow Chancellor talking to the Labour Party conference here in Liverpool in 2018. People standing for him there.
Thank you. Thank you. I take it that applause was for Bill Shankly. I just want to say something personal before I start. Some of you may know over the recent period, our friends in the media have not been as supportive as maybe we would like them to have been. And they've attacked my friend. They've attacked him because he stands up for the ideals and beliefs that we all have. I just want to say, Jeremy, how proud I am of you for the dignity in which you've withstood that vilification. I've got a sore throat, I'm losing my voice, I've been talking too much, and I might have a Theresa May moment, so if the backdrop starts falling apart, will you let me know? I want to say thanks to the people. Look, I speak the words. I want to say thanks to the people who do the real work. That's my Treasury team. Peter Dowd, Shadow Chief Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, Annalise Dodds, Clive Lewis, Lynn Brown, Lord Dennis Tunnicliffe, and Lord Brian Davis. And our team have got a special thanks as well to my Parliamentary Private Secretary, Thelma Walker. She joined us this year because she won Colne Valley back from the Tories. Thanks, Thelma. This month is the 10th anniversary of the financial crash. J.K. Galbraith, in his book on the 29 crash, said, "Sure, you can try and create institutions that seek to avoid crashes in the future, but the best protection is memory." So it's worth remembering the causes of the crash. They were greed, yes, and the deregulation that turned the city into a multi-billion-pound casino. But more importantly, it was caused by the power that a small financial elite exercises over our political system. That power meant the bankers and speculators who caused the crisis wouldn't be the ones who paid for it. It would be our families, working people, our businesses, our young, and especially the most vulnerable in our society. And it's been 8 hard years of austerity and economic failure. In the 6th richest country in the world, it cannot be right that 5,000 of our fellow citizens are sleeping on the streets. It cannot be right. It can't be right. 4 million of our children are living in poverty. 2/3 of them are in households where someone is in work. That tells you that wages are so low, below the levels of 2010. The wages not sufficient to provide a decent standard of life for many of our people. The Tories have created an age of insecurity where people have little, if any, control or power over their lives. So it's no wonder that so many people voted for Brexit. It was an anti-establishment vote. So I believe it's time. It's time. It's time to shift the balance of power in this country. It's time to give people back control over their lives. You know, there's another anniversary this year. It's 100 years ago, in 1918, the Labour Party adopted Clause 4 as part of our party's constitution. Let me remind you what it said: to secure for the workers, by hand or brain, the full fruits of their industry. I say the Clause 4 principles are as relevant today as they were back then. It is fair, democratic, collective solutions to the challenges of our modern economy. You know, the Labour movement has always believed that democracy shouldn't stop when we clock on at the factory gate or in the office lobby or, like my mum, behind the BHS counter. Democracy is at the heart of our socialism, and extending it should always be our goal. Our predecessors fought for democracy in Parliament against the divine right of kings and the aristocracy. They fought for working people to get the franchise. Our sisters fought for women's suffrage in the teeth of ferocious opposition. And our movement fought for workers to have a voice at work. And the trade unions founded this party to take that democratic vision even further. So in 2018, I tell you that at the heart of our programme is the greatest extension of economic democratic rights that this country has ever seen. And it starts in the workplace. It's undeniable now that the balance of power at work has been tipped against the worker. The result is long hours, low productivity, low pay, and the insecurity of 0 hours contracts. I want to thank the IPPR for its recent report. It was a brilliant critique of the inequality embedded in today's economy. Archbishop Welby took some stick in the media and some in the establishment for his support for the report. He wasn't engaging in party politics. He was simply speaking the truth as a moral leader in our society. Just a few words of advice for the Archbishop. Archbishop, when they get round to call you a Marxist, I'll give you some tips on how to handle it, okay? So I want you all to be certain. I want the country to be certain. We will redress the balance of power at work. First, we'll be proud to fulfil our late leader's promise, John Smith's promise, that workers will have trade union rights from day one, whether in full-time, part-time or temporary work. Day one. We will lift people out of poverty. We'll lift them out of poverty by setting a real living wage of £10 an hour when we go back into government. And wages will be determined by sectoral collective bargaining. And yes, we'll make it a mission of our government that we will tackle the continued scandal of the gender pay gap that hurts so many women within our society. So, real power comes from having the right to a collective say at work. Large corporations play a huge role in our lives, yet the decisions about the running of them are in the hands of a tiny elite. Employees who create the wealth have no say in the key decisions that affect their future. So after decades of talking about industrial democracy, Labour in government will legislate to implement it. And as Jeremy announced yesterday, a third of the seats on company boards will be allocated to workers so they have democratic rights at work again. Power also comes from ownership. We believe that workers who create the wealth of a company should share in its ownership, and yes, in the returns that it makes. Employee ownership increases a company's productivity and encourages long-term decision-making. So let me thank the Co-op Party, and in particular Gareth Thomas MP, for his ideas on how we extend common ownership within our society, and some of the ideas we're saying today. I can announce today we will legislate for large companies to transfer shares into an inclusive ownership fund. The shares will be held and managed collectively by the workers. The shareholders will give the workers the same rights as other shareholders to have a say over the direction of their company. And yes, dividend payments will be made directly to the workers from the fund. That means payments could be up to £500 a year. That's 11 million workers, each with a greater say and a greater stake in the rewards of their labour. True industrial democracy coming to this country. You know, we all know it's not just the employees of a company that create the profit it generates. It's the collective investment in infrastructure, in education and research and development that we as a society make that enables entrepreneurs to build and grow their businesses. So we believe it's right that society shares in the benefits that that investment produces. That's why a proportion of the revenues generated by the inclusive ownership funds will be transferred back to our public services as a social dividend. So over time this will mobilise billions that will be spent supporting our schools, our hospitals and our social security system. You know now we're proud. We're going to extend economic democracy even further in this country. How? By bringing water, energy, Royal Mail, rail back into public ownership again. You know, some of the press said the voters would be horrified. They couldn't have been more wrong. Public ownership has proved its popularity in opinion poll after opinion poll. But it's not surprising, is it? Look at the scandal of the privatisation of water. Water bills have risen 40% in real terms since privatisation. £18 billion has been paid out in dividends. Water companies receive more in tax credits than they actually pay in tax. And each day, enough water to meet the needs of 20 million people is lost due to leakages. With figures like that, we can't afford not to take it back into public ownership. Well, let's be clear to people. Nationalisation will not be a return to the past. We don't want to take power away from faceless directors to give it to some office in Whitehall, to swap one remote manager for another. Today, Rebecca Long-Bailey and I are launching a large-scale consultation on democracy in our public services. We're also setting out our plans for a new publicly owned water system that puts this essential service where? Back in the hands of local councils, workers and customers themselves, the very people of our country. There will be unprecedented openness and transparency in how the industry will be managed in the future. We're ending, let's be absolutely clear, we're ending the profiteering in dividends, the vast executive salaries and the excessive pay interest payments that have been made that has sapped this sector. And the surpluses will be reinvested in water infrastructure, in staff, or to use to reduce the bills. And real investment will allow the highest environmental standards as well. People, the message is clear. People have just had enough of being ripped off by privatisation. And that's why we've said, as you know, no more PFIs, no more PFIs, and we'll bring them back in-house. So to drive our public ownership programme absolutely through in government, we'll set up a public and community ownership unit in the Treasury itself. It will bring in the external expertise that we need, of course, but let me make it absolutely clear that the full weight of the Treasury will be used to take on any vested interest that try to thwart the will of the people. We will drive this policy through. Do you know, there's some that said our manifesto was a fantasy or a wish list, attractive but ultimately not deliverable. I'm telling you today, we're planned, we're ready and we're prepared, not just to fight another election campaign, but to implement that programme when we win that election. And when we will, we're going to take firm control of investment decisions by government. For too long, the establishment has used the Treasury as a barrier against putting power back in the hands of people. So we will reprogram the Treasury. We're going to rewrite its rule books on how it makes its decisions about what and when and where to invest. We will end the Treasury bias against investing in the regions and the nations outside of London. And we'll make sure it assesses spending, all those spending decisions against the need to tackle climate change, to protect our environment, to drive up productivity and meet the investment challenges of the fourth industrial revolution. We need now to exert some people power over our tax system as well. Let me just say this. There are millions of businesses out there which deserve our respect and we will always support. They're responsible, ethical entrepreneurs who pay their taxes and support our community. They should know how proud we are of them. But there's a minority who don't live up to those standards. They avoid paying their taxes, yes, on an industrial scale. They're denying our hospitals, our schools and carers the resources that they need. The Tories' record on tackling tax avoidance and money laundering has been a disgrace. So we can't trust the Tories on this, but we shouldn't just wait until we get into government. We should act now. One way is to mobilise shareholder power to demand companies uphold basic tax justice standards. Numerous institutions, yes, from trade unions to churches and pension funds, have large-scale shareholdings in many of the companies that are continuing to avoid their taxes. So today I'm announcing my intention is to bring together these organisations to launch a shareholder campaign. We'll be demanding that companies sign up to the fair tax mark standards, demonstrating transparently that they pay their fair share of taxes. So the warning. So the warning, make it clear and make it loud, the warning to the tax avoiders, the game is over. Over. Recently, Gordon's got a great sense of humour. I was on a platform with him not a short while ago when it was announced that I was the Shadow Chancellor, and Gordon said, actually, he's always been the Shadow Chancellor. I have a lot of affection and respect for the man. Again, I want to say to... We may not have voted always the same way. I have a lot of respect for him. Recently, Gordon, I think, made a very important statement. He expressed his concern at the current weaknesses in the global relationships to deal with any potential future economic crises. I agree. With major nations on the brink of a trade war and with climate change accelerating, we can't risk the kind of international breakdown that led to the Great Recession, the Depression itself. And as at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, there's an urgent need now to work out if the current international system can cope with these threats. Over the past few decades, that system has concentrated power in the hands of an international financial elite. Individuals, communities, and even nation-states have been made increasingly powerless. It isn't working for the Western world, where stagnant wages have helped feed the rise of the racist right. And it isn't working, certainly, for the developing world, whose wealth is plundered by multinational corporations or stashed in Western banks. So what we're going to do now, we're taking this matter seriously, as Gordon advised it should be. We'll be convening in the spring an international social forum to bring together leading economists, politicians and civil society representatives. We're going to launch a dialogue on the common risks we face and the actions we need to take. And I'm really pleased to announce that Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz has agreed to lead this discussion for us. Thank you, Joseph. This leads us on inevitably to the urgent question of Brexit. Though I don't have to repeat the criticisms we all have of the Tories' behaviour that have been echoed in all our debates. Their failures are in plain sight. I just say to the Tories, just in the interest of the country, get out of the way and let us get on with securing a way forward. A way forward that will protect our economy, our jobs and the standard of living of our people. If they don't do that, you know what my preference is. I want a general election. I want it soon. And we're keeping all the options open for democratic engagement on the table. But look, I feel so strongly that these Tories should face the people. Face the people for the way in which they've recklessly put our country's future at risk over the last 2 years. More interested in fighting each other than fighting for this country. On so many fronts, you know the scale of the mess that we will inherit from the Tories. A society whose social fabric has been run down to the point of near dereliction. A struggling, mismanaged economy, vulnerable to another crisis. Past Shadow Chancellors have come to conference with warnings about how bad the situation will be that we inherit to lower people's expectations about what can be achieved when we go into government. This Shadow Chancellor is different. I want you to know the greater the mess we inherit, the more radical we have to be. The greater the need for change, the greater the opportunity we have to create that change. And we will. We will. The Tories' austerity has been brutal. But what I've resented the most is that they've tried to take away the dreams, the hope and optimism of our people, especially our young people. That dream of building a better world. That dream of building a better world and passing it on to your children as previous generations have done. But they've failed to understand us. They've failed to understand that we have an unwavering faith that together people can change the world. And they need to understand we will not settle for anything less. Yesterday, the Tories, well, it was reported in the press that the Tories were drawing up secret plans for a quick general election. So the message from this conference is, bring it on. Bring it on. We're ready. Whenever that general election comes, we're ready. We're ready to campaign for victory. We're ready for government. We're ready to build the future. And you know, like Bill Shankly, we'll be proud to call that future socialism, solidarity.
Chancellor John McDonnell ending his speech after about 25 minutes, shaking hands with Jeremy Corbyn, the party leader. They're giving him a standing ovation, as is normal at party conferences. The Shadow Chancellor says that they're ready for government. He challenged the Conservatives to bring it on, a general election he was talking about, and he did set out a radical, as he called it, plan for the economy. A lot about restructuring the economy, putting much more power into the hands of workers and employees. He said the balance of power had tipped against the worker over the last decade, and he wanted to address that. He said that the principles of Clause 4 are as relevant today as they were when they were written in 1918. We'd already talked, of course, a little bit about some of his plans to give workers a third of seats on boards and to force companies to give up 10% of their shares to employees and create an employee fund. He also restated some of the themes that he outlined last year: nationalisation, particularly on the water company, a new publicly owned water system in England run by local councils. And he was going to rewrite the rule book for the Treasury and drive through some of the policies that he would put in place as Chancellor. Helen Lewis and Faiza Shaheen are here. Helen, first of all, just your thoughts about the speech.
I thought it was very interesting, the way that it wrapped together all the themes of Labour, you know, this idea for the many, not the few, but which is fascinating because we've always heard for years now that the renationalisations are popular individually and by themselves, right? So people look at the trains and they think, I don't actually think the trains are really brilliantly run. I think we could probably give nationalisation a go. But Ed Miliband was never able to work that into a kind of coherent narrative. And what you're seeing with that, I thought the reference to Clause 4 was very interesting. So you are seeing a proper kind of Labour story, and all the policies, all of them speak to that same theme. And that's what he's done very well in this speech. The bit I found weird, I wish they would stop doing this, the kind of shout out to Grandad Jeremy at the start, hasn't even the press been beastly to him? Labour complain all the time about people in the media saying it's a personality cult. Well, don't start off by saying, I love Jeremy at the start of all your speeches then, frankly.
I mean, it made you feel slightly queasy, that, at the beginning. What does it say about Jeremy Corbyn? He's had a difficult summer, clearly. He's obviously been personally hurt by some of the calls on racism and anti-Semitism. I mean, Faiza, is it really justified to accuse the media of something that they would claim is actually of Jeremy Corbyn's doing, particularly over the issue of anti-Semitism?
Can I just say, we've just had a speech there about policy, laying out a very different agenda for this country, something that gives power back to the workers, that does something about the inequality that so many of us are so angry about. And yet so quickly we've turned to talking about Corbyn. And I think that's really
Well, it was
unfortunate.
at the very beginning of his speech, wasn't it?
That's just a shout out. It's just a shout out to say, you know, he's his friend. It's just a shout out. The majority of that speech is about this plan. And so I would prefer to talk about that.
Sure, but
and I think there's a lot of exciting things.
We will talk about that. But on that, I mean, because Helen raised it, why do you think that is necessary?
I think it is necessary because, look, this has been a year where Jeremy Corbyn's been called a Czech spy as well. I mean, it is a bit nuts how much, just how much the media kind of comes out with stories about Corbyn. But I do agree.
We won't see at conference next week. Everybody's starting off with like, let's the
beastly
media
lay off. This is the very
Theresa.
basis of our movement. Is solidarity, is giving each other support. So we know that Jeremy Corbyn has been the fall guy too often, and so he gets a lot of attention. That's not to say in general we shouldn't have done much more about anti-Semitism. I know a lot of us are upset about that. But look, let's put that aside. Let's think about the real what John McDonnell is really putting a crosshair in terms of economic democracy, about sharing power.
All right, well, let me
again.
ask you about that. On the sharing power. We know from the CBI that they are worried about some of the proposals. They say it'll cost companies billions. How will you reassure them if all of the policies that were outlined by the Shadow Chancellor are mandatory? They're going to force these things through and onto business.
Look, you shouldn't be surprised. Any chancellor that comes in is going to drive through their policies. That's just normal. They have an agenda.
So they are going to force businesses to do all these things?
Well, we have a change. We have a complete change in the way that we want businesses to operate. Now, in the beginning of my career, we were talking about all of the same things. FTSE pay, CEO bosses getting 150 times and lowest paid workers. I mean, it's just, we're fed up of talking about it. We want to take action. And all we're saying is that here is a program, a lot of it taken from things that other countries do, a lot of it just reversing the massive transfer in wealth from private to public that happened during the 80s and 90s, and saying, do you know what? The public should own the water. They should own the trains. It makes complete sense.
Right. I mean, that's obviously the narrative. But in practice, forcing these things on companies, how easy will it be?
Well, one of the most interesting lines of the whole speech has got to be this idea where we use the full weight of the Treasury.
Absolutely, to drive the policy through.
What is interesting about John McDonnell is he has become a details man, and he's got a keen attention to what the levers are. So we talked about there in the speech about the kind of divestment movement. We've already seen that with companies and fossil fuels, and those kind of bits of pressure that you can get. And the shareholder plan is exactly the same thing. If you have much more company shareholder, that gives people much more of a voice. What he's doing is paying attention to the way that you can change the system in order to kind of actually then achieve it. And so in the sense of lawmaking, that's only one part of it, and he's trying to work out ways in which you can put pressure on companies to do things of their own volition, encouraged, shall we say, by people power.
I mean, what sort of timescale would you expect this to happen? If there were a general election and Labour came to power, how quickly would you expect a Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell premiership to put in place these plans?
No. They're really ambitious. They're working very much on the detail. They're thinking about what that first 100 days of government looks like. So I think, a lot of the things we're hearing about today will start being put into action very, very quickly. Now, it will take time, of course, to do all of the things that are on the agenda. But I think some of it will happen quite quickly. You'll see the movements towards this vision very, very quickly.
And what about the costs? Because the CBI think it'll cost billions to do the two key planks. That's about giving workers a third of the seats on boards and to give them a share of the profits. How much would it cost, Pfizer, for a new publicly owned water system in England run by local councils?
Well, I think this is the thing where we often talk about how much it will cost with water and bringing it back into public ownership. Water is an asset, so the idea is over 10 years it will be paid off. I forget the exact sum, but it will be paid off, and that is then an asset we hold again. So then we can decide what we're doing in terms of the money, in terms of investment. We have 1,000 Olympic pool size water lost from the system every day. We can make all of that investment. We'll just have a lot more say because we'll be there, regional boards will be set up, and we'll be able to take that back.
Because the costs are important. I mean, that is what people will be poring over, is if this is a plan, a radical plan, as John McDonnell has described it, what will the cost be?
I think that the fact check last year would put water renationalisation at something like £69 billion. But as Pfizer says, what you then do is get an asset that is currently generating money on your balance sheet. But all of this, it will cost a lot of money. Scrapping PFI, well, why do we have PFIs? Not because of some magical belief that they were the best way to do it necessarily.
Because Gordon Brown was a big supporter.
But because it was a way of getting stuff, public investments through off the books without increasing your borrowing.
I mean, this is the heart of it, isn't it? Because basically they did that, and say Bart's Trust has ended up paying much more back than they should have if it had been just government had invested. Because we've been too scared to say that actually government debt is okay, it's quite normal. You look around the world, there's a handful of countries with no debt. We are at an important time in history where we have climate change, we have an aging society, we have automation. This is the time when we have to invest, we have to be bold, we have to be ambitious, and that is what this plan is.
All right, we're going to go to that other conference that we were talking about, Elizabeth Glinker at the World Transformed. Elizabeth.
Hi, thanks very much, Joe. I'm joined now by Shingy Shonua, who's the lead singer with the Noisettes, and also Dave Randall, who's a musician. He's been chairing the panel here this morning. So, Shingy, starting with you, why are you at the festival?
It's just a really amazing excuse to come and talk about the power, the transformative power of music to uplift people. We're at a really troubled times, and I think it's our job as musicians to bring everybody together and encourage people to speak out about things that they feel uncomfortable about, and just to learn, really. And my friend Dave invited me here, and he wrote an incredible book, which I was one of the first people to be able to read.
It's all about the book promotion, guys.
Yeah, well, he's my host. I love Liverpool as well.
Yeah.
Got friends and family
so, Dave,
up here.
Today's discussion was about kind of the impact of culture on politics. That's clearly something you're interested in. And do you think that's something that's quite important at this festival, the link between those two things?
Well, it's one of many important things at the festival. But yes, I mean, one of our panellists, Loki, has a lyric, how do we use the power of culture against the culture of power? And what we did today was have a discussion about how we can do that, how we can indeed bring creativity and music into political campaigns, and vice versa, bring politics back to the parties, like the summer music festivals, the Notting Hill Carnival and so on, and how we can bring the politics back to mainstream culture.
And Loki, of course, is the rapper who's been very, very heavily involved in the Grenfell campaign following that tragedy. Let's talk a little bit about the conference. I mean, are you going to the Labour conference as well?
No, I won't be. I've actually got another thing to do later, but I really just came because I'm not really used to kind of like public speaking, but my friend invited me, and
it was important.
I just thought it would be a really good experience. There's some amazing musicians here.
Yeah.
I saw an incredible band last night called Afro Sadajo from
Thank
Brazil.
you very much
so, yeah.
to both of you.
Yeah,
Hope you
music,
enjoy the festival.
really.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Back to you, Joe.
Yes, thank you. Let's find out what Joel's been doing. Fact check, Joel. Looking, I think, at some of the figures mentioned in John McDonnell's speech. Joel.
That's right, Joe. So John McDonnell was talking about the Labour Party's plans for the water industry, and he was saying that there are various problems with the status quo, and he said that one of the things is water bills have risen 40% in real terms since privatisation. Now, I called Water UK, which is the trade body for the water companies, and they said that technically that is true, but they said that most of those rises occurred in the first few years after privatisation, and actually that prices have been relatively stable since 1994. That's what they told me. And they also said that the industry has announced plans to cut bills by 4% in real terms between 2020 and 2025.
Joel, thank you very much. A final word from you two before we go at the end of the show. Helen, how do you think it'll go down here, that speech?
I think it's got some really... the thing with John McDonnell's speeches is always look at the difference between the rhetoric and the policy announcements, and that one's got some pretty hard-edged rhetoric, but I think the policy announcements are chewy and really interesting.
Liza?
I think it's just a reminder that we are ready for government, that the detailed work is being done, that we know what our programme and policy will be.
Thank you both very much. That's it. That's all we have time for.